include a right to the land itself. If you've heard of the concept of Aboriginal title, Aboriginal title is another Aboriginal right, and it's a right to the land itself. So those rights can be asserted. They have to be proven in court and all of that. Or they can be negotiated. Well, back in the 1800s, the Crown had the foresight in some parts of Canada to try to negotiate with primarily First Nations, every now and then the Métis, to try to negotiate these rights. We call those rights that are negotiated agreements treaty rights. Now, in your case, we're dealing with a claim by the Thessalon First Nation that there was a breach of their treaty rights in the 1850 Robinson-Huron Treaty. Now, I need to emphasize something here. Those rights are constitutionally protected. So again, I'm going to take you back to April 17, 1982. So when you read the treaty, if anybody have ever looked at the Robinson-Huron Treaty, that's not just any old document. According to our law in this country, it's actually part of our Constitution. So when you read the Constitution, if you wanted to read every part of our Constitution, you would have to read the Robinson-Huron Treaty. It's actually part of the highest law of the country. So now think about it. Now we have an assertion that, and what the Thessalon First Nation has said, and the governments have accepted on its face. So I don't know the legal, so if you ask me the legal analysis, I don't know the legal analysis, but they've accepted on the face the claim that the land, so they were to get a reserve under that treaty, and that the size of the reserve they received was in fact smaller than what was promised in the treaty, in return for them not exercising their rights. So there was a contract there. The government's accepted that claim. There are hundreds of these claims. So while the government was quite ready to negotiate the treaties, we have example after example, and including not only First Nations, but also Métis. If you look at the whole script process in the prairies, for those of you familiar with it, where the government was quick to sign the treaty, but didn't do a very good job implementing it. Now this was before 35, and the consequences of not doing that, but as a result of Section 35, guess who's got to fix that? Your governments. We can't have these outstanding claims. They fundamentally create uncertainty, they create legal liability, and I'll frame it as constitutional liability. Got to be dealt with. So, Thessalon and Ontario have engaged, or have started the engagement in trying to settle this, what they're calling the boundary claim. How big should the reserve be? Some of you, I believe, and I believe some of this is readily available. I know for me on the internet I was able to find it, the asserted areas by Thessalon of their both traditional territory and claim area. Keep in mind that that's their assertion. That's not what will necessarily be agreed to between Ontario and the First Nation to settle this claim. That'll be part of the negotiation. But the First Nation has every right to assert whatever they want. It's a free country. The issue isn't what they assert, it's what's ultimately negotiated. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. I'm not going to get into that yet, about the actual negotiation. Now, these claims, so in 2017, so just last year, Ontario and Thessalon First Nation signed a negotiation framework agreement. For those of you, and I assume a lot of you don't sort of deal with these kind of words, so the framework agreement, that is code for a process agreement. And what that agreement is designed to do is to guide the negotiations. Those agreements can take many years just to negotiate those agreements. That's why there's a backlog, and don't quote me on the number, but I believe federally the number is well over 1,000 of these types of claims, or not just boundary claims, I want to be very clear. Other claims related to the lack of implementation of treaties. There's over 1,000 of these floating around. So these things can take some time. So it has only been a year, and you might say, only? Well, I've got some sort of, and again, for those of you who are more, and I know there are a number of people who are fairly sophisticated in this area in the room tonight, you'll know what I'm about to say to be very true, and it can be very frustrating for people, and perhaps for good reason. I'm not here to necessarily defend this, by the way. These things can take a long, long time. It's frustrating for the First Nation. It can be frustrating for the Métis, if they're involved in negotiation, but for the First Nation on these claims, I am aware of some that have run over a decade. I'm aware of one that ran almost 2 decades. It's appalling. Imagine if you're the First Nation, how frustrated you feel, but also governments are frustrated, and the public, people who may be, and I say may, we'll get to the may in a minute, may be affected by the claim. It can be extremely frustrating. In my view, and again, I can only deal with the facts that, as I know them, and so there may be facts I don't know, but 1 year into a negotiation is not a terribly long time. I run a lot of commercial deals. We can get a lot of deals done in a couple weeks. For those of you who do business or do contracting all the time, you know that if you've got willing parties and you want to do a deal, it can happen quickly. These are not easy processes. Government's got its whole mandating process. There's all the interests that need to be considered, and ultimately the broader community's interests. Remember the reconciliation? I'm going to get to those interests in a minute. They must also be considered. Now, what's been out there publicly, and I don't know if this has been made available to people, but there is a fact sheet that is public. It's September 2017. And in that, and look, it's a useful document. I wasn't terribly surprised when I read it. And again, I do this every day, so I read this and went, there's nothing in there that surprises me, but certain things jump out. The recognition of private property rights and the validity of those private property rights. Well, that's important. One would like to say that goes without saying, but it's important that it was stated. The Ontario government says in the fact sheet that consultations will take place alongside the negotiations. So they've committed publicly in this to consult, in my view, with the broader community. Again, I'm going to get to what the update is that I'll share with you that I told everybody I would share with you. And then, I'm actually quoting from this now, the rights and interests of members of the public who are concerned about or could be affected by a settlement will be taken into account. Well, what's that mean? By the way, I have that question too. I'm actually asking the question, what's that mean? And key will be, in my view, and I'm going to conclude, I'm going to give you my conclusion right now. In my experience, again, I've been doing this a long time, and it doesn't mean I'm necessarily right, but I was asked to share my views, so that's what I'm doing. I used to be chief treaty negotiator in British Columbia. So I was responsible for up to 23 different sets of negotiations in the lower, for those of you familiar with Vancouver, in the lower mainland. And key for us, and I stand by this, was to ensure that we had a fully informed public. If we are serious about reconciliation in Canada, and I believe we are, I believe there is, I think our governments generally, and I certainly think the government of Ontario is serious about it, but it can't be done in a vacuum. Everybody's got to come along for the ride. Everybody's got to understand what's at stake. And everyone's interests must be considered. Now, I don't want that to be interpreted to suggest that the First Nations constitutionally protected rights are somehow always equal to the broader public rights. The law says that at times those rights can override government's authority. But any suggestion that those rights are absolute, and by the way, I don't hear this from First Nations typically, but sometimes governments try to frame it that way because their hands are tied. They can't do. Well, it's not true. Governments, and look, I sometimes deal with this in the prairies. Sometimes governments sort of playing First Nations and Métis off. Oh, well, we can't deal with the Métis. You got to deal with it. And it's like, hold on, you're the government. This is before we get to the non-Aboriginal interests, just among the Aboriginal interests. The burden rests with government. And in my respectful view, it's not debatable. There's no room for debate on this issue. So, I'm going to end on that point too, but I'll come back to that. So, they also say in this fact sheet that public consultation meetings will occur along with meetings with local municipal leadership. I want to be very clear, and again for First Nation members that are in the room, for any government officials who are here, in my view, it's in everyone's best interest. Look, there's an element of these negotiations that they have every right to have confidential in terms of part of the negotiations. You can't have a public negotiation session. We'll never get deals. And whether, so this isn't about whether there can be confidential negotiation sessions. In fact, I would urge them. I'll just be honest with you. We all want an agreement as soon as reasonably possible. It's in everyone's best interest to have these claims settled. It just is. And it will ultimately create certainty. But it can't be done ultimately at the end of the day without everybody being brought along, being fully informed of what is potentially at stake, in my view. Ontario also states in this fact sheet that there will be a land component. Now, this is important. So that is the final settlement. So they've started off with some fundamental principles, is my reading. So I'm not the negotiator. I can only read based on what I have experienced in the past. I read this. And what I believe that they are saying here is that they expect this to be a cash and land deal. And that's typical. So if you look at the entitlement area, the claim area, it covers a pretty big area. Well, the fact is there's some folks who own land in that area now. That land's not on the table, by the way. And it's not going to be up for expropriation. By the way, that would be unprecedented in Canada, notwithstanding the fact that they've assured everyone that that's not going to happen. That doesn't happen, in my experience. I'm talking about private land. We'll talk about interests in Crown land. So if you're leasing Crown land, it's a different issue. That is a very different issue. But in terms of private property, it's not on the table. However, they've talked about the concept of willing buyer, willing seller. We'll talk a little bit more about that too as we get into this. So, private property is not on the table. And the other principle that the government's in writing on its website saying is that it'll be land and cash. So what that means is practically is that they don't plan on, and this is how I interpreted this, that all of the outstanding land that is due isn't going to be provided necessarily to Thessalon. But some of it will in land, and some of it in compensation. So, and that's not shocking. That's typical. When I read that, again, my mind immediately goes, okay, well, that's like many of the other boundary disputes I'm aware of. And I think, personally, I think that's a good thing. It means that it's starting to follow a pattern like some of the other settlements that we're aware of. Now, a question, the settlement, the intended purpose is that the lands ultimately become part of the reserve. And so the importance of consulting with the province, the importance of consulting with your local governments, your municipal governments, and the importance of consulting with local stakeholders becomes very important. Now, there are varying degrees of debate about whether Canada, so now the federal government, so it's the federal government that accepts the land as reserve. So the province is negotiating the deal. The province can't create reserve land. Reserve land is the federal government. So eventually, my understanding is the plan for this land to become reserve, and certainly Canada's view is that there needs to be fairly extensive, broad consultation with broader stakeholders. Now, I was asked a few questions, and I'm going to get to a number of them, but let me put out a couple of the core ones. Is the claim useful? And this question, by the way, if you're from the First Nation, I think you know the answer to that question. But from the non-First Nation perspective, I believe the question really was intended to say, is the settlement of the claim useful? My view is that as long as it's a reasonable settlement, it can be very useful. The claim's not going anywhere. We have no intention of amending Section 35. So it's not as if the Thessalon First Nation is going anywhere. There's no indication that their constitutionally protected rights are going anywhere. And there seems to be no appearance that their bona fide claim for breach of the treaty right is going anywhere. I work for a lot of businesses, including in the forest sector, the mining sector, obviously very relevant in this neck of the woods. And these issues can be material from an investment point of view. Now, they can also affect investment, and I understand that. We'll talk about that in a moment. So is the claim useful? Well, in my view, I would say the answer is clearly yes, in terms of settling the claim. And it can actually promote not only certainty, but it can also assist, if done correctly, economic opportunities. There will be an influx of cash to your local economy. The fact is Thessalon First Nation makes up part of your local economy. And so we've seen this in other scenarios. I'm not an economist, but there's no question that if done properly, remember I'm using that caveat, if done properly, there can be benefits. And ultimately, it can promote better relations between First Nations, and if Métis are involved in a claim, but I'll say First Nations for the purposes of Thessalon, and the non-First Nation community. I've seen it, we've witnessed it across Canada, and that's good for everyone. Ultimately good for communities, ultimately good for economic growth. So the potential is there, and again, I underscore the word potential. I am not giving you an opinion tonight that, yes, automatically this will be good, but I'm also not going to tell you that the sky is falling. I've not seen evidence of the sky is falling with respect to this claim yet. I've not seen any evidence of that. I'm going to talk to you about some of the things to keep an eye out for, though, in my view. The other question, and let me just say this, one final thing. In terms of the settlement being successful, my advice is, and my advice to Ontario, my advice to Thessalon, they've not asked for it, but I would offer it up to all of you, is that open, transparent consultation with the broader community is really nothing but a good thing. Again, that's why I applauded the organizers of this event. Having information is nothing but a good thing. We shouldn't be afraid of Section 35. We shouldn't be afraid of claims. We shouldn't be afraid of non-Aboriginal interests, though, either. Because none of you, I assume, are leaving anytime soon, and neither are the folks at Thessalon. And we just need to make sure some people, whether it's in Toronto or in Ottawa, also remember that there are real people that are ultimately affected. So the other question we got asked was, well, how will the claim affect private individuals? And look, let me tell you the easy answer. And sometimes it's the answer you hear from government. And by the way, you'll notice I haven't commented on Thessalon again. They can take whatever view they want. They have every right to take whatever view they want. Mind you, they have to live with all of you and neighborly, but individuals won't be affected directly, typically. These things aren't typically, and again, I'm using my words, now I'm playing lawyer here. I'm using my words carefully. Typically, they don't affect individuals directly. I'm going to give you a few scenarios to keep an eye on, though. how these claims can affect private individuals and businesses not directly benefiting from the claim, but maybe not part of Thessalon First Nation. The biggest issues typically are the indirect effects. And I'll talk about them in a moment, but things like access, your tax base, services related to the tax base, and valuation, depending on how the reserve land or the claim is settled. Are we talking about 1,000 individual parcels? Or are we talking about 5 big parcels? Well, that matters. You know that probably better than me. You know your geography better than me. So these things can be important, and we don't have any intel on that. Eventually, I think, certainly my assumption is that that will be known, and I'll talk a little bit about that process momentarily as well. So it's the indirect effects. So one of the other questions, and so now we're getting into the effects. Well, what about access? So if most of the claim is settled by way of cash, I mean, this doesn't affect access. I mean, you've got essentially another private property landowner. If they don't buy land in fee simple, that'll be subject to the normal rules affecting fee simple land. The issue is if there is a land component, we believe there will be. I think you ought to assume, based on, I think the government's been very clear in the fact sheet, and from what I read on Thessalon's webpage, it's very clear, and it's very helpful to know this, that they expect a land component. A land component, so not their entire claim area. Obviously, because a lot of it's covered by private property interests. But the issue will become is that when land is transferred, how does it deal with the specific access issues that may be involved? Now, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately at this point, I can't give you a specific answer to that. And you know the reason why. Because every one of your parcels are different. So it's very difficult to say generically. We were talking sort of hypotheticals earlier today. And yes, access rights could be affected. But until you know precisely what parcels there is interest shown in, my view would be that is a purely hypothetical exercise. Now, the concern is not hypothetical. It's a real concern. And for, again, the non-First Nation folks in the room, you have every right to want information prior to any deal being consummated or any agreement in principle of knowing where the areas of interest are for the actual parcels that would make up the land component. And it is my view, it is in everyone's interest that in due course, as this information, we don't even know what information has been exchanged between the First Nation and, other than the broader claim area, about what specific parcels is their interest in. It's at that point, as the rubber hits the road, that the access issue then becomes real. Because then you can actually look at your property or the property at play and go, okay, if that land were to become reserve, and let's say there's an access road going through the middle of the parcel, let's say, does the road go with the land? So I don't know what Thessalon's views are. Some First Nations want the road, some don't. If they don't want the road, that's one set of issues. What if they do want the road? And what if the province is willing to consider the road? Well, then we talk about, what access rights are going to be. And the folks who use that road are going to have a lot of concerns about that. Again, if you notice, I'm not saying the sky's falling about this. I've seen a lot of these deals where at the end of the day, there's no access issues. I've also seen some horror stories. Not so much on boundary claims, but in treaty negotiations in British Columbia, for example, where and again, I'm talking about British Columbia now, where access was promised. I was at that table acting for an industry party. We were looked right in the face and told, don't worry about anything. And then the agreement in principle was signed, and guess who paid the price? My client, who wanted access to their dock, where they were running product off of. Well, it's not very good. So access is something that you want to keep a very close eye on. Now, the province has said that it doesn't cancel Crown land leases, easements, mining claims, timber allocations. There's been some recent stuff in the news about that, and other licenses and permits during their term. My interpretation of that is that means that they may not renew after their term. I'm not trying to be provocative, but that's what that means, in my view. What that means is that if there's an expression of interest in Crown land by Thessalon, and the Crown, hopefully based on consultation with the broader community, is inclined to provide that land as part of the land, that while they may not disrupt existing tenures or interests or whatever the rights are provided by the Crown, timber interests, or what else do we have, permits, easements, or leases, that once those terms expire, they may or may not be renewed. Which is, as you know, the Crown's right, but this is where the consultation becomes so critical. There shouldn't be any surprises. In my view, and again, I'll just say this, and this isn't a legal answer, but in my view, if we're serious, remember reconciliation? Remember balancing of interests? There shouldn't be any surprises here. It's in everybody's best interest that if there is an intention not to renew a permit, my very strong counsel to the Government of Ontario is to give people as much warning as possible so that they can plan their affairs, so that they can protest it, so they can express their view. And I actually think it's in the best interest of everyone involved. Not necessarily to change whether the deal, look, these things can play out a whole bunch of different ways. But if we're serious about reconciliation, God, there's a number of you who've heard me speak before, I know, in the room, and I'm a bit of a, again, remember I act for industry. If we're serious about reconciliation, we've got to be transparent. So, but it's too early in the negotiations right now, based on what I have seen, certainly that's publicly available, and based on my discussions with the negotiator for the province and their legal counsel. Certainly my understanding is there's no sense, I'm just telling you what I heard, no sense of what specific parcels are at play at this stage of the negotiations. Now we're a year in. Am I shocked by that? Is it possible that's true? I would say yes, that is possible, that's true, believe it or not, 1 year to negotiate. Some of you I know have expressed, like, gee, it's been a year. And we, now at the same time, I'm not giving you a warranty of what I heard is accurate, and I don't want it to be interpreted that I'm questioning. I had a very good discussion with these folks, but I'm not in a position, and I have to be honest with you, of whether or not to say, well, is it accurate? I'm not party to the negotiations. So, the second issue, and by the way, I'm fairly close to concluding, but let me tell you about the second big issue. The nature of the land, and I commented on this briefly. Is it 1,000 or no, I'm exaggerating, I don't think 1,000 different parcels is at all reasonable, and I don't think that's being contemplated, but for the sake of me making the point. Is it 1,000 different parcels becoming reserve? Or is it one big one? Or is it probably more than likely, with many of these settlements, it may be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 fairly large parcels of land. That's all relative depending on where the claim goes. So why is that important? As a conceptual, so again, until you know what the land is, there could be a small parcel of huge significance. It could be, I've seen small parcels be a major issue. I've seen major parcels not be a big deal at all. You know better than me, you know your land base. There may be places that are more so until you know the parcels, you can't engage in any sort of, other than the principle, it's all hypothetical. But the principle is, hopefully this is helpful to you, the thing to keep an eye on is what is the nature and the size of the land? Because in my view, that can be directly relevant to the issues that arise around access, around tax base, and around things like valuation and basically trying to prevent the island effect. Now, I've not heard the province say anything yet other provinces do. British Columbia, at one point, I apologize, I don't know what their policy is today in British Columbia. I did know their policy, and they were against islands. And I don't mean your beautiful islands, I've seen some of those. I mean islands of land, where you've got sort of a holdout parcel, and there's reserve all the way around it.
My name is Mike. I've been listening with a lot of patience here. And just by way of a brief introduction, I served as a commercial arbitrator and have acted many times with members of your firm, Castles, Block and Graydon, at least that's what it was called at that time. I've also had the privilege of authoring a rewrite of the national leasehold policy of the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development.
Yeah.
I've also been the president of the 5,000-member Appraisal Institute of Canada, and also for 6 years chairman of the International Valuation Standards Committee. All this means that I've been kicked in the shins so many times it doesn't hurt anymore. But what I've learned is this matter is not going to be resolved on a lot-by-lot, acre-by-acre basis. That's not going to get you to the end product. It's going to be resolved on the bands getting together or separately, drawing up a list of what is going to make life better for the band. Medical center, hockey rink, who knows? But you add that all up, put a price tag on it, and the feds can say, yep, no. That will resolve the issue. If you're going to argue on an acre-by-acre basis, it ain't going to go anywhere. I've had a long in the tooth. And as I've said before, I've been exposed to it. And I know it won't work. And my family is also involved with the First Nations. 3 of our members of the family have been the chief of a band in this area. So we know the internal workings, the politics of it. And where the nonsense starts and where the nonsense should end. If you want to resolve it, my humble suggestion is get that shopping list from the band. And that is a way to lead to a resolution where everybody can save face, everybody's going to come out a winner, and you're not going to argue that my acre is better than your acre, and my access is better than your access. And if you take this piece of land away, we're going to have unemployment and blah, 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 blah. That's my suggestion, sir.
Well, no, I mean, again, I'm probably the wrong person to tell that to. You need Mark up here probably to tell that to, but I don't disagree. I mean, any of the deals that I've been involved with involving First Nations and land, all the First Nations I've worked with come to the table with a pretty sophisticated approach to what they're interested in, and I'm only assuming, my assumption would be that that's happening or will happen, we don't know, at this table. And presumably that will be helpful to moving the table forward. But Mark's probably the one that needs to hear that directly. I've got that question, then we'll go over here. So, yes, sir.
I don't imagine that I'm standing alone tonight when I say that the information you've given us is pretty well the history building up to this point. You can give us nothing else, and I understand that after listening to you.
Good.
You can't offer facts. And I think probably the biggest majority of people in this room came with questions that you're not going to be able to answer. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know what the questions are, but what I will say is
everything about fish and game rights, access, etc., etc. There are no positives that can come out of you from what I see. Now, I don't mean to embarrass you at all.
Because you're not embarrassing me, don't worry about me.
Leading up to it. But I can see these questions are not going to be answered tonight.
Well,
it's the wrong forum.
Certainly I don't represent Ontario, so I can't answer those questions. I'm not sure though if it's like a specific, so if it's a general question about fish and game, Ontario might be able to deal with it. But if we're talking about specific parcels, my sense is Ontario wouldn't be able to answer your questions either, because I don't think they know what lands
No, I
are
don't think
fish area.
anybody does.
No, so now's not the right time.
But we thought maybe a lot of us, this was a time we're gonna get some of the introductions to the answers.
Yeah.
Obviously not.
Certainly not for me, I'm not at the table. Yes, sir.
I'll identify myself for those of you who don't know me. My name's Art Bennett, I'm from Bruce Mines, and I'm a Métis citizen. Now, I'm concerned about how this is going to affect the Métis. We're talking about consultation and so on and so forth. Going back to 1850, some of my relatives were there with Shinwalk when the treaty was developed and signed. Shinwalk wanted the Métis included in that treaty. In the Batchewana. Robinson said no, he would come back and treat with the Métis. And talk about negotiations or things going on a long time. That was 168 years ago, we're still waiting on the government. And to my knowledge, there's never been any consultation by the government with Métis in the area on our rights. We've never ceded anything. This was our land, and they come in and negotiated treaties with First Nations. It was First Nations and Métis land. White people didn't exist here then. They weren't here. Actually, my great-grandfather went with Shinwalk up to Mica Bay and put the Montreal Mining Company out of there at gunpoint, and that's why the Robinson Huron Treaty came about. So I have a long history in the area, and like I say, we're patient, we're still waiting, and I'm wondering how is this going to affect Métis race, because our lands overlap. Our harvesting areas, will they be First Nation harvesting areas? Will they allow us to harvest in their areas? Will we have to negotiate a separate agreement with First Nations? Again, a lot of questions, a lot of things unanswered, even for us, the Indigenous people, so.
So thank you, nice to see you again. So I've been focusing on non-First Nation rights generally, but I have a very specific answer to your question, that the Métis will need to be consulted by the Government of Ontario with respect to any settlement as well, because of your, or the Métis, constitutionally protected rights. We've seen examples in the prairie provinces where both Canada and the provinces have been reluctant to consult. Now, this doesn't deal with the non-Indigenous crowd here tonight, but I mentioned it in passing in my comments about that there's a tension within the Indigenous community by governments, and sometimes I won't comment between Métis and First Nation, but by governments focusing on First Nations and not also focusing on equally constitutionally protected rights of Métis. And this has been a real issue in parts of Ontario, and certainly like Manitoba and Alberta. And the legal view, in my view, is not even debatable. So I think I'm specifically answering the question. I think that there's no question that with respect to this specific claim, that there would be an obligation on the Crown to consult with Métis with respect to the potential effects of this claim on asserted or established Métis rights.
The last I heard, though, we haven't even been notified. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, this has been how many years into the making?
Well, you can quote me on what I said here, but I hope it's of use to you. I listen, I hear you, and you see how these issues are. There's layers to these issues, and anyway, I hope that was clear. Yes, sir. And then we've got a question over in the back.
Yeah.
There as well.
Hi, my name's Al Mush. I've been coming up here since the late 60s. I'm from Michigan. My mom and dad bought a place on Bright Lake in '73. Now it's been transferred to my son also when I died. Do we have to worry about this problem in our lifetime?
So that's a fair question. Yeah.
My son's 50 years old.
Yeah. So and again, it would be much better if a government person would respond. Look, I think it's reasonable to assume that this will take a number of years to conclude. My assumption would be is that it's not going to take 10 years. It's my starting assumption. But, you should ask the province that question. I'm sorry, but that's it. Should you be concerned, generally? Look, again, I'm not going to come here and tell you the sky is falling. We don't know, and it was going to the other gentleman's question, I think he's left now, but
You talk about this Thessalon all the time here. Does Thessalon control the Bright Lake and Basswood and Iron Bridge area?
they're...
Huron Shores.
Huron Shores.
Yeah, Huron Shores, yeah.
Right. So,
They're making a claim. Part of that claim is going to be some land. If private parties want to sell some land, that could be considered, if they want to sell. But remember I said there's all these other principles of how big the parcels are going to be. So somebody wants to sell an acre by themselves, that's probably not going to become reserve land. That would breach a lot of policies that I'm aware of Canada. To have 1 acre in the middle of reserve land. So there's a number of, and again, you won't like my answer because it's there's a whole bunch of variables, and I ran through a number of them tonight. So until we know the specific parcels, and it goes to the gentleman's earlier question, I understand the frustration, but I'm not sure the province knows at this point. Until we know the specific parcels, can I look at you and tell you you don't have to worry? No. But I'm also not going to fearmonger and say, look, oh boy, we got a big problem here. What I would say is, if it was me living here and it was my land, I would want to keep a very close eye on what's going on. I would be insisting, and I would not accept no for an answer, that the province keep you fully informed. And I think you have a right to be fully informed.
does the Huron Shores municipality have the government that we want to contact them for this, or we still contact the email that you gave us in that?
I would deal, the provincial negotiator is Mark, I'd be dealing with him. I would also deal with your local government representatives too, about what they're doing. Well, no, but in terms of looking out for broader municipal interests. And again, I'm not going to say the sky's falling on municipal interests. We won't know until we know what lands are at stake. But you asked a question about should you be concerned. Look, my concern would be is not knowing. Right now, that's what and I know you've got this, I think a lot of you have that concern, and what I'm trying to say is you're right to have that concern, because if you don't know, you don't know. I don't know.
And another thing, how do we find out how far this agreement goes? How many acres or miles this thing goes?
We don't
Who's all
know. We
involved
don't
in it?
know. Well, we know what the Thessalon's claiming a large area, but we don't know what the settlement
Where
will
do
be.
you find that information? Where do we get the area that they're claiming?
So I would ask, you can ask, I don't have copies of it with the claim, but I believe it's online. I mean, I got a copy of it offline. But that's the kind of information, again, I'm not here to defend the province. You should have copies of that. I just want to deal with this one question about, and a very good question, well, where's a map of the claim area? And the fact that you don't have that readily accessible, and it's not easy to find on the internet, that's a problem. That should be readily accessible. I mean, the First Nation has a right to claim an area, but you also have a right to have...
How can we access it?
I'm sorry?
What?
Who's got the map?
I would call Mark Richard an email, and that's the email I gave you. Thessalon FN claim.
Be able to download it to us and know?
Presumably, yes. Surely the claim, yeah. But see, this is part of the problem. I mean, I'm agreeing with you. I think it's really amazing that it's not public and out there. So look, we had one question there, and then I'll go to this gentleman up front. Yes, sir. If people could I just need to hear the question. I won't be able to hear it.
Okay, my name is Gold. I am executive trustee of my husband's estate.
Yeah.
Do I have, it's on.
Folks, I'm sorry, but I can't hear the question, and I understand people may want to chat, and you might want to just take it outside, because the people who want me to answer questions, they got to be able to hear them.
How far did you get?
Just a
I am
minute.
trustee executor of my husband's estate.
Yeah.
Okay, but 3 houses are on the market. Do I have to tell the prospective buyer that this is under the Robertson Treaty, or is this buyer beware?
By law.
Now, I usually don't get stumped. Just see, was my face turning red? I never get stumped.
Okay, did you understand?
Oh, I understand. That's why I'm stumped. It's when I don't understand I can give a pretty good answer. That was a good. So, you're not going to like my answer, but I'll be honest with you. I don't know. And I'll tell you why. No, I'll tell you why I don't know. I don't practice land law in Ontario. In British Columbia, I could give you an answer because I do know that I live in and I've got a house and assets in BC and I do know the answer to it. You do not have to disclose in BC. For example, that my house, the land that my house sits on in West Vancouver is claimed by 2 First Nations. And they want the land back. It's an assertion of Aboriginal title. So I'm just being honest with you. It's a very good question. I'd ask your lawyer here in Ontario. You know something though, it's a good question for the province. And again, I'm not trying to deflect, I just honestly don't know the answer. It's a very good question. I like that question. And I will find out the answer for myself because I would like to know for myself what the answer is. I'd be surprised if there's a disclosure on something of that nature that rests with the Crown. But I will not give you an answer if I can't give you definitive legal. That's a legal, I got another legal question here earlier, duty to consult. I gave a legal answer, you heard me, it was very clear, I think. I thought it was a really good answer, I thought it was clear. But your question is equally very clear, but I won't give you an answer that'll just sort of make you feel like I would never do that. So I don't know the answer to it.
Tell my lawyer and maybe she'll advise them.
Who does land law? I'd like to know the answer too, but I'm going to find out on my own what the answer to that is. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Tim Woods, Cooper Lake, an old Thessalonian. My question is, in your opinion, would it be helpful if we would all get together, sign a petition, asking Mr. Richard to have an open meeting like this?
Oh, absolutely. And again, I'll be honest with you, I'll leave it to you about how firm you want to be in that, but the organizers of this have rung the bell, so
I'd like to thank the organizers.
Well, I think you should, I'll be honest with you. I think it's wonderful, I think it's a great opportunity. I think they've done a good public service here. They shouldn't have had to do it.
No.
They should not, at their own expense, I might add. But let me say this, I think you should be quite forceful with it, and I would say that to Mark if he was here right now. I think it's in the province's best interest to get out in front of this. And you want to spend more time understanding claims. You want to spend more time, the question earlier about fish and game. I don't know the province's policies, and I'm not going to make them up for you. I'm not. It's not my job to do it. I don't like misleading people. Again, some of you have heard me speak before. I don't hesitate to say when I don't know something. There's nothing worse than somebody telling me something. And it's my whole point about reconciliation and truth. That we've got to be speaking, so I don't know the answer. But what I would say is I would be quite forceful, but I think you have every right. And again, in a respectful way. Everybody here tonight has been very respectful. There's been some tough questions. I got a number of questions. And look, you have a right to ask those questions. But I think you have every right to press on the provincial government. And if they were smart, they'd get out in front of it. The messaging I heard back is they want to do that. So I would take advantage of this opportunity and take them up on the offer. You can tell them I said they said it. Okay? Whether they listen to that or not, I don't know. I don't have any influence here. Yes, ma'am.
I don't really have that much of a comment, but one of my problems is the rumors that are going around, and a lot of them are coming from Thessalon First Nation. Don't worry about this, we're gonna take all your land and you're not gonna be able to do any logging, and that means the mill has to close, we'll buy it, and we might let you work here. All this kind of stuff is going on. And I think a lot of the turmoil in the non-native population is being very greatly contributed to by Thessalon First Nation. And my little brain is saying, the people at Thessalon First Nation don't know any more than we do.
So thank you for your comment. I mean, I would say the same thing to Thessalon. I say it with respect. They're a government and they've got their own members to deal with, but everybody's here for the long term. We all know they have constitutionally protected rights. I can tell all of you there's no debate about that. That's then why, so typically that's the key principles in some cases. Here that may not be a reasonable principle to apply. But I would certainly think the principle, and again I apologize, I'll say it sort of more colloquial, but just no islands. Fundamental. Now, what do I mean by islands? Well, we could have, depending on what your land looks like, there's probably as many examples as there are people in this room of what those examples look like. So I don't think it's necessarily helpful. I'm certainly not going to run a hypothetical because it will vary, but the principle is important. And we should not be shooting for islands. And it would be good to get your government, and I say that to both First Nations and non-First Nations people here, to get that confirmed, that that's in fact the approach. And notice I said not about Thessalon's approach. Thessalon has every right to whatever approach it wants to take. They do. They have every right to take whatever approach, as any of us do in any negotiation. But the public government bears the burden of representing the public interest, and remember the balancing, and doing it in a reasonable, thoughtful, prudent way. That I think you can take to the bank in terms of what the law stands for. Finally, there's another big issue, and it's the tax base issue. And again, I'm only going to speak to it by way of principle. But a critical discussion for municipal governments, and I'm not saying it's an issue here, but could be your tax base. And it's not just the tax base itself, it's everything associated with it. Your services, whether your roads are getting plowed, or your fire service, for example. Things like that, but they're directly, again, you know better than me, you're paying your taxes. They're directly linked to the day-to-day, for both First Nations and non-First Nations people, in terms of the services that are provided by way of the tax base. I do tell municipal governments to be careful, and look, I advise provinces too, but you got to call it as you see it. Municipal governments need to be very careful when they're involved in these negotiations. I used to be the person on the provincial side, and our best thing would be is to bring the municipal person on the team and subject them to a complete confidentiality agreement and not let them speak to anybody. So at the end of it, you go, well, look, we kept so-and-so informed. Well, and I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that's happening. I have no evidence of that in terms of people being prevented from speaking. But what I'll say is this, be wary of it. And it's not because necessarily people are doing nefarious things. I want to respect the confidentiality of the table. That's important. I want to be clear about that. But there's a balancing between keeping the appropriate people involved and what's the deal on public consultation before anybody signs off on that. That's not an unreasonable thing, is what I would say. And I would say that to anybody involved in the negotiations. So I want to be clear, you've got to preserve the confidentiality at the table. That's helpful for all of us because we want a deal. We want a deal probably sooner rather than later, quite frankly. That would be my advice to all of you, First Nations and non-First Nations. But that can't be at the expense of keeping the non-players at the table. Sometimes this even happens within First Nations. And again, I'm not here to speak for Thessalon, and I'm not speaking about Thessalon here, but I've been involved in other scenarios where we on the other side have been going, gee, we'd like a little bit more community consultation on the First Nation side, so we know that the deal we're about to sign, everybody, those are things for the negotiation table. And again, I'm not here to tell Thessalon how to run its affairs. But from the non-Indigenous perspective, before we start signing off on confidentiality protocols, let's make sure that there is a reasonable process that both preserves confidentiality at the table, but doesn't leave it to one person or something, so that the local government is fully engaged and bound by the confidentiality terms, but also with a plan ultimately for public consultation. Where is the commitment? And that's what your municipal government must defend. Must, in my view. And the province should be going to bat for that. And this isn't against Thessalon or anything. This has nothing to do with Thessalon, and I say that with respect. This has to do with informing the public in a reasonable, measured way at the appropriate time. So, my discussions with, and I'm about to conclude, so sorry if I know it's probably a little warm in here and I appreciate everybody's patience. So I had a discussion with the provincial negotiator, Mark Richard, and essentially here's what I was told. It was a very good discussion in my view. It was emphasized to me that they are still at the very, I quoted, I've got my quotes, these are my notes from the call. I decided that I would bring those with me. We're at the very early stages of the negotiations. That's why I mentioned the year. Is that shocking from somebody who does this? No, it isn't. Some of you may find that shocking after a year. It doesn't surprise me. These things can be long and they can be very frustrating. Two, they confirmed to me that it's the province, and I'm telling you this for a reason. They knew I was going to share everything they spoke to me about. But I think it's important that I pass this on to you and do it in a public way. So that when you finally have a provincial negotiator up here, you can remind him what I quoted verbatim. That your existing access will be preserved. Now, that's good as a principle, but we're not done yet. It will depend on the detail. So the principle's a good principle. Existing public accesses will be, whether it's to waterways or roadways and all that, will be preserved. But as they say, the devil will be in the detail. And again, don't interpret that as a naysayer, the sky is falling. The sky may not be falling. But it's also possible that there could be an access issue. And the province has told me, as they sort of said also on their website in that fact sheet that I mentioned, that existing access will be protected. They also commented to me on, so I did make a comment. And again, I have to say, I really do give credit to your organizers. They wanted to get information out about Aboriginal rights, the rights of First Nations, and well, also Métis, because you have Métis in the area, but we're here to talk about Thessalon First Nation. And that's great. But also to talk specifically about the claim. And I said to the province, I said, you know, and I'm happy to do this because I'm always interested in private property rights. I've been writing a lot in this area. I travel across the country defending the rights of these simple landowners. And it's not against First Nations or Aboriginal. I want to be very clear. It isn't. If you're looking for somebody, I very typically don't have arguments with First Nations or Métis. That may surprise you. All I do is Aboriginal law. You might go, well, what do you do? I do run the odd court case. Okay, we do have First Nations across the table from us in court. It's typically dealing with government when I'm acting for private parties. That's typically where the issues are. So what they said to me, though, I thought was very valuable. I thought it was great. It was a very good message, and I want to be very clear about that. That they plan on moving from a more reactive, because there's not much going on according to what they told me, so they don't have a lot to report. But I think, again, some credit is due, that they want to become more proactive in getting out and talking to all of you. And I think you should hold them accountable to that. It may be that they repeat everything I just said. That's all we got for you right now. But it would be much better hearing that from them than from a lawyer who lives in West Vancouver doing it. So I said that to them. I said it a little bit maybe nicely, but all joking, like, it is serious, and you should have Her Majesty's representative here. I would encourage the Crown to get out in front of this. And if they don't have much to report, to look you in the eyes and tell you, look, here's where we're at. And when we get to a stage, then they can start telling you more about the process. Based on my telephone call, I am expecting that you'll see that. I want to be clear, though. Public consultation to me is public. And again, I've been on the other side negotiating. for provinces. And I'm proud to do that work, by the way. You know, representing the public interest. But public means public, and it means letting everybody ask their question. And I would encourage the province, and again, feel free to quote me on this, I encourage them to have sessions like this and let people ask their questions. There's never a dumb question in this area. I assume you're not all experts in Aboriginal law. You know, that's my general assumption. It's probably good for me that you're not all experts in Aboriginal law. But you have every right to ask questions. And so I really wanted to end on that point, that in my conversation with them, and I would encourage all of you, I actually think it would be very positive for the negotiations. I do. You have to, I really believe that. I actually think it's positive to have healthy discussions, robust discussions. We don't all have to agree, but the notion of people sort of feeling left behind, whether you're actually left behind or not, this is your community, and your neighbors with Thessalon. You're all going to be living, it doesn't really matter what happens. At the end of the day, everybody's going to still be here. I mean, I take a very, you know, by the way, I like to write books and stuff too, but at the end of the day, you're all neighbors. And so it's in everyone's interest that we encourage a healthy, respectful dialogue and not be afraid to answer questions. I told you what I believe Canadian law is. I'm not sure if all of you like necessarily Canadian laws. You may love what Canadian law is. In some ways I couldn't care less, to be honest with you. Why? Because you're entitled to your view. But my job, when I speak publicly, is, and I'm very careful about what I say about the law, and if I'm not sure, I always put because I do a lot of public speaking. I've been doing a lot about Métis rights, and sometimes telling First Nations that Métis rights are equally protected under the Constitution with First Nations rights can be a tough thing to deliver. But it's true. So, I'll end maybe on that note. I hope that was helpful. I'm absolutely happy to take questions. I know we had a series of questions. I did circle a few others, and do you think it would be good that I touch on a couple before, or just open it up?
That's your call. I have a specific question that, listening to you speak, and I know we've had various conversations. My main concern is, how do we keep the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs and Reconciliation at the province and the Mark Richards of the world on their toes? Does everybody here phone him? Does everybody here write him? How do we make it clear that, hey, we want our day?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I'm not necessarily the expert in all things of government. I do spend an awful lot of my time in Ontario. Let me give you a few thoughts on that. First of all, Mark encouraged me to tell all of you that they have a dedicated email and telephone number set up. And again, I take that as face value. I take that as genuine, just to be very clear. And I would take advantage of that for questions, concerns that you may have. You may have follow-up from this presentation that you may want to take up directly with Her Majesty, it's government, and you should. And you should avail yourself of that. Mark, and I want to give full credit here, I mean, he encouraged me to tell you all of that. And that, I don't know if that's been shared with everyone, but there is an email address, and I'm happy to even read it out. Maybe I should just do that. No, does everyone have it? Or
No.
so here is Mark's telephone number. Is 416 326 1853. 416 326 1853. By the way, I'm not done my answer to it. I'm going to speak just for another minute on this answer. It's a good question. I'll give you the email address. Thessalon, you all know how to spell that. FN, F as in Frank, or F as in first, and N as in nation, claim. Thessalon FN claim at ontario.ca. So that's important I deliver that message. I promised Mark I would do that.
How do we give Mark feedback that some of us, I'm one of them, registered on that email address 6 months ago, they would share information. Do you know how many emails have come through on that? 0.
Yeah, so I don't have an answer for you on that. What I take from my discussion with them was that there's nothing to report. What I would suggest to the Government of Ontario is that they should send out an email every 3 months to say, things are moving more slowly than we thought, we're still dealing with this, so there may be some, so I wasn't able to find out exactly what's going on. There are some process issues, we're waiting for some information. These are all very common reasons, by the way, I'm just hypothesizing here, but wouldn't that be helpful? So that you're not left again hearing from someone like me giving you the email address for, I mean, if it was me, I'd be all over it. I'd send something out every month. I would, and I would encourage the government to do it.